Yes? Okay, I'm Charles Gati. The Russia-Eurasia Forum meets on every second Wednesday in a small seminar room in this building. But for this occasion, for the topic and for the speaker, we moved to this auditorium. I'd like to welcome the audience, especially our students. We'll get a first crack after Mr. Lukyanov's talk to ask questions. And I welcome our speaker, Fyodor Lukyanov. He is widely regarded as one of the 2 or 3 top Russian commentators on foreign affairs. His talk today is co-sponsored by the Gorchakov Fund, about which I should know a lot, but I don't. Just very briefly, Mr. Lukyanov graduated from Moscow State University in 1991, practically at the time or right after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Before, but shortly.
Shortly. Yeah. Is there a relationship between your graduation and the collapse?
Of course, but I will not speak about that here.
No. Okay, we'll discuss it privately.
Absolutely.
Okay. He has a degree in philology, if I understand it correctly, as well as in German language and literature. And I do see signs of his interest in language in his writings, very carefully phrased. He has acquired the style and characteristics of what's done in Foreign Affairs magazine that many of you know, the quarterly, or now it's every second month. It's a combination of an article and an essay. In other words, it is meant to be both objective and subjective. It's a wonderful genre. And he does that not only in his own articles, but in the very important magazine that he edits in some collaboration that's, again, unclear with Foreign Affairs magazine, and it is called Russia in Global Affairs, which is the single most important magazine on foreign policies and international relations in general, published in Moscow. He's also chairman of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy and research director of the International Valdai Discussion Club, which just finished its meeting, I believe, last week or the week before. He has agreed to talk on the topic of, quote, Russian perception of America in turmoil. I'm a little troubled by the title, although I think I gave it, because perception, it should be perceptions, but it says Russian perception of America in turmoil. So maybe we can clarify that in the discussion session, which will follow his approximately 15-minute talk. It is my pleasure to welcome you to SAIS, Johns Hopkins, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Gati. Thank you for this opportunity. I think I was here once many years ago, maybe 7 years ago or so, at a discussion with students, and of course at that time it was completely different atmosphere, and agenda was a little bit more encouraging than today, but it's even more important to have this opportunity now. Yes, this trip has been supported by Gorchakov Foundation, which is a Russian semi-independent, I would say, foundation promoting, so to say, understanding between Russia and the rest of the world. And I'm very grateful for their financial support. And the hosting organization on this site is Wilson Center, which is well known, and I'm very happy to collaborate with them. Charles, you mentioned nicely that in my writings I'm carefully phrasing things. And I think it's very rare skill nowadays, because to to phrase carefully is not something which is very much welcomed nowadays in international affairs. And in this regard, the competition of who will say it more bluntly, more vocally, and so on. And unfortunately, on this field, we also see competition between Russia and the United States as on many other fields. So I will try to be very brief because I think it's much better in current circumstances. It's much better to have interactive exchange. So I will try to limit myself to 4 or 5 points just to describe what was put in the title. I fully agree with you that there is no Russian perception of the US, which is, so to say, one right perception. There are many perceptions, but I must say that what happens nowadays rather brings different groups of Russian thinkers and commentators closer to each other. Because before that, before changes in US policy, in the White House, we had quite clear distinction between those who were more critical about the US policy and those who were, so to say, more sympathetic. And it reflected old Russian intellectual divide between more pro-Western oriented people and less pro-Western oriented people. But since Donald Trump occupied Oval Office in the White House, it's a bit of confusion because those who used to be anti-American, initially they expected Trump to move closer to understanding of Russian position. Then it turned out completely differently, so they moved a little bit different directions. Those who used to believe that US policies are right and okay, they now are a bit in trouble because they don't understand what is the guideline of US policies. So to try to summarize atmosphere, again, there is no unified view on the United States, but just to try to make it average measuring of temperature in the hospital. So first of all, I think many of people agree that we never seen such kind of United States before. United States, which is to a certain extent source of most uncertainty in world affairs, more than anybody else. And to a certain extent, it's really unique because at a time when America was in difficult times internally and was in domestic turmoil in 19th century, in 20th century, but at that time, America never did not play that role in international affairs as now. And since today's world is, whether we like it or not, America-centric, and now and for certainly years and decades to come, US situation will define a lot of international development. So that kind of turmoil in domestic politics in the United States has major impact on international system, international situation, and no one can basically ignore it. And this is a new factor. Secondly, just a continuation of the first point, what happens in US development is actually reflection of general situation when we see everywhere that countries, small countries, big countries, middle-sized countries, they confront significant and sometimes very complicated processes inside. It's another long discussion to what extent globalization influenced development in particular areas and nations, but it's pretty obvious that line between domestic and international almost disappeared since global economy and as a consequence global political development started to emerge after end of communism and end of the Cold War. And it used to be rather opposite direction. So the international development made major impact on domestic situations in different countries. And in Russia, we felt it very obviously because Russia went a pretty complicated path with not very successful results. After 20 plus years, Russia managed to become part of global development, global economy, global politics, but for reasons which are sometimes difficult to understand, all negative sides of globalization, we got it. But as for positive sides and positive opportunities, which China, for example, managed to use, we failed with that. So now we are, in this regard, facing a very profound choice what to do, how to operate in this new changing global environment. But anyway, it was this direction from global to domestic. Now we see rather the opposite. When the US president proclaims this famous slogan, America First, whatever he means, it will have impact on everybody. So if America is first, then everybody is starting to think how to make politics in the same way. China is first, Russia is first, Europe is first, Indonesia is first, and so on. And in this regard, we rather see growing impact of domestic needs of the United States on international agenda. And what happens sometimes in areas which are extremely important for international stability, be it the Middle East or East Asia, sometimes it seems that steps taken by US leadership and US president are rather motivated by necessity to address some domestic needs and not those particular crises. Third point, and I think it's more important than two first ones, and this is a matter of quite lively debate in Russian intellectual circles. To what extent current situation in the US politics is due to personality of Donald Trump, or is it just a reflection of very profound processes in the US society and international development at large, and Trump is a rather exaggerated embodiment of this, not the reason, but rather the product of this development. And of course, there are again different views in Russia, but I think that prevailing view, which brings many Russian scholars and the practitioners to particular conclusions, is that what happens in the United States is only to limited extent due to personality of the president. Otherwise, this is, so to say, new trend, which is generated by results of previous time when the United States took position as international leader. And this role, successful, unsuccessful, it's a matter of discussion, but this role has been exhausted. And now, as any international development is going through different cycles, we are entering the new cycle of much less global and much more individual nation-oriented policies. If it's true, then there are no big reasons to expect significant change after President Trump. Of course, some personal characteristics of President Trump might catalyze particular trends, But again, I think the growing understanding in Russia is that we should not subscribe all of what is happening to the personality of leader. That means that this stage of relationship between Russia and the United States is hardly to be overcome after Trump, whoever will succeed him. As for Russian-US relationship, well, we just had a short discussion with Professor Gati before this meeting, and I think we both agree that to a certain extent current situation is worse and more dangerous than it used to be during the Cold War, at least for one reason, that the Cold War time was more structured hostility and confrontation, which was defined by certain rules of behavior. Those rules were not brilliant at all, and the stability caused by mutually asserted destruction and fear was, of course, nothing which we should aspire now, but at least it was much more regulated situation. Now it isn't the case, because on the one hand, whatever we do between us, between Russia and the United States, US-Russian relationship is not the centerpiece of international system and international relations. We see multiple new players emerging. China is obviously part of any game anymore, but not only Chinese. We see many countries which traditionally were seen as just followers of anybody else's politics. They are now pretending and claiming to play independent role. The most obvious example is Turkey, for example, Turkey, because until relatively recently, Turkey was seen as a fellow part of Western alliance. Now we see that President Erdogan remembers that Turkey is a member of NATO in very particular situations, and otherwise he behaves as if NATO does not exist. And that makes, of course, our situation much more complicated, because it can look like the Cold War style relationship, but since the context is completely different, we cannot expect same kind of settlements as at that time. Much is based on results of development since collapse of the Soviet Union. I don't think we need to discuss it again, because this is part of Russian narrative since very long time, how Russia has been treated after the Cold War, whether Western euphoria about collapse of the Soviet Union was, grounded, and what kind of geopolitical achievement and geopolitical trophies the West obtained after it. That's a discussion which can continue forever. Personally, I think that much of what happened after the Cold War was inevitable, and theoretically we can speak about non-enlargement of NATO after collapse of Soviet Union. In practical terms, of course, if Soviet Union would win the Cold War, I think Netherlands would be a member of Warsaw Pact as automatically as Estonia became member of NATO. But the fact that I understand why it happened does not mean that it was good and it was okay, because now we see results of that. And I think many people who promoted this development in 1990s, including people in Russia who basically believed that it was not that bad and it was okay, they miscalculated. And unfortunately, much of things we have now is product of that development. At the same time, it's important to be said. Again, it's not. I'm far away from official position in this regard. I don't think that repeating this narrative over and over again, as many of Russian leaders do, it doesn't help much, and it doesn't make sense anymore for one simple reason. even with President Obama was pretty far away from the Cold War experience, and obviously he was not much interested in that. But still with him, not to talk about George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, it was possible to continue this exchange in terms of what happened and why it happened, what did you do to us, and so on. And I think many those who follow a Russian-American relationship can remember the first meeting between Obama and Putin when Obama came to Moscow in July 2009. And it was Putin was prime minister, but Obama went to visit him at his residence. That was a very funny entourage with samovars and Cossacks and all possible folklore presented for Barack Obama. But the conversation was pretty one-sided. That Putin explained for 50 minutes to President Obama all bad things Americans did after the Cold War. And Obama listened carefully and took notes maybe, and then he said, thank you very much, and the meeting was over. So now I'll try to imagine this kind of conversation with Donald Trump. I can't do it. For one simple reason. If to this argument that look how badly Russia was treated after the Cold War, natural reaction of Donald Trump would be, that's fine. Of course you lost. If you lost, what did you expect? Because for a person from real estate, and real estate is not just business, it's not IT, it's not manufacturing, it's a real estate business with a very particular principles wherever it happens, in Russia, in the US, or in China. And that's part of the game. If you lost, you lost. And that's why I think that we should change this narrative, because it does make sense anymore, and start to try to address current issues. And of course, I'm sure you will ask me about the particular situation with Russian meddling and all this, which is now being discussed in the US on each place, on each TV channel. And so I arrived yesterday late. I switched on television. First thing I heard was about Russian interference. Now it's counterattack by Trump team against Hillary Clinton, and so. Of course, as a person having absolutely no connection to security services and having no clue to understand how this cyber stuff works, I don't know what happened. I cannot deny, I cannot confirm, I just don't know. The only thing I can say to you, and we can then discuss it more detailed in Q&A, I would be much more, it would sound much more credible to me what I hear here, what I hear in the United States, if I wouldn't be old enough to remember Soviet time and post-Soviet time. Because when I was young and we listened to Soviet television explaining to us how Americans interfere everywhere, what they do to us and want to destroy us and to change our historical choice and so on. At that time, me, as most of people, and that was late period of Soviet Union when actually not only intellectuals but also many ordinary people stopped to believe to what television said, we believed it was a bullshit. When I hear now literally same phrases here about Russia, I have my doubts. Because if I didn't believe that in my country about Americans, why I should believe that here about Russia? But we can discuss it. And finally, I think that what we need is, of course, much more serious discussion, not just about Russian-American relationship. It seems to be very difficult nowadays, but part of the game, which I'm afraid is not fully understood here, because I think that this willingness to subscribe all bad things to Russia is part of denial to understand that world changed profoundly. The whole world changed profoundly. Russia is facing very tough choice and decision how to operate in this world. But United States, to a certain extent, is facing tougher choice because this is a big change of understanding which place United States can have in this changing world. And that's why I believe we need to go beyond this day-to-day political and mostly domestic political stuff. We can discuss Russian situation as another great thing about schizophrenia in Russian public debate as well. But that's even bigger confirmation how much more attention we should pay to global trends which are generating all this development domestically. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We do have, I think, plenty of time for discussion. Let me pick up just one point about how Russian policy is made and the extent to which will be my question, the extent to which it is influenced by what's happening in the United States. I don't think the question is really simple at all, because when you talked about just now about the 1980s and how you stopped believing and many others stopped believing what you saw on Soviet television. The next sentence is not necessarily what was your next sentence, which is you see similar things about Russia being said compared to what was said about America on Soviet television. But the continuity in Russia itself, which is to say, when I read President Putin's speech last week, where I believe you chaired the meeting and you were seated next to him. Well, that was, he could have said pretty much the same thing on Soviet television in the 1980s or the 1970s even. In other words, it's our fault. Whatever has gone wrong in the world. And you know, there was a musical, I don't remember the precise words in New York that I saw a few weeks ago, which had nothing to do with Russia or the United States, but it had to do with interpersonal relations, notably in marriages. And my wife Toby, who's there, probably knows it better than I do, what the line was. But I think in the musical, the punchline at the end was, and it's all your fault. In other words, an argument between husband and wife, and then it came, and it's all your fault.
You should take it as a Russian national anthem.
Yes, yes. So I guess what I'm trying to find out a little more is, you know, you're saying you and I disagree strongly about NATO enlargement. I think it's an excuse for telling the world, and above all telling the Russian people, that the US remains as hostile as ever to Russia. I think without NATO enlargement, the same thing would have continued as well. Perhaps it hastened the process of ending that reasonably good relationship under Yeltsin and Kozyrev that existed in the early 1990s. I don't know that. It's hard to replay history with difference, just moving one or two items out and then saying this is what would have happened. But it's the continuity of hostility is remarkable.
Continuity is remarkable. There is a difference between, you said that Putin could deliver the same speech in 80s or 70s. I don't think so, not exactly, because the difference, and I think it's development to the worst direction. The experience of 1990s, 2000s, was an experience of hopes and expectations that never came true. I think you know what happened in Russia after collapse of the Soviet Union. It was a period of extremely sincere wish to become part of something like a Western community. It was an unbelievable naivety on the Russian side. Again, it was very sincere. It was not, now unfortunately, some people in Russia try to present collapse of the Soviet Union and what happened after as a result of hostile forces. It's not the case. I remember that time I was part of, no, not part of changes, but I was student and then a young journalist. And of course it was, for many people, very, very positive and optimistic period, maybe the most optimistic we ever had. Approximately between 87 and 90, when Gorbachev was still very popular and many believed in that this new political thing was implementable, that was really time of very, very bright expectations. To a certain extent, what we have now, it's product of that, because pendulum, which went very, very far to the side of pro-Western euphoria at that time, now it's at the opposite position. And this is what changes situation from the previous Cold War, because in the Soviet Union, Soviet leadership never had any expectations. Even at time of detente, it was no idea, so to say, that we will be together. It was the idea of minimizing and controlling risks and tensions. Unfortunately, you mentioned this musical about interhuman relationship and family. This is like between people, between human beings, that after a period of very, very sincere hope, then you suddenly see that the hope was utopian, and then you turn into deep depression and frustration. So in this regard, it's worse. At the same time, I think that I try to be realistic all the time. I think that we have to realize that there are very profound differences between Russia and the United States, be it in Soviet incarnation or in Russian incarnation. Objective differences as geopolitical and in terms of thinking, US and Russia are to a certain extent two opposite poles. I mean, philosophy of social development. So it's absolutely inevitable to have a very complicated relationship. What was better in the Cold War, we really had some mechanisms to regulate this confrontation. Now sometimes it feels we are in free fall, and this free fall is not parallel, but also asymmetric, which is even worse.
Okay, the floor is open to questions. I think I will ask you to please two things. Identify yourself, okay, so that Mr. Lukyanov would know who you are, and to make your question as brief as possible. Students, I will call on students, or who I think are students. We're all students because we're all interested in Russia, but some of us are older than others. Yes, Maria.
And then slowly that, would you say it was Kosovo and that intervention, or is it something else?
Turning point was maybe yes, maybe Yugoslavia, because I remember how much shocked a lot of people, including those who were pretty positive and pro-Western, they could not understand this.
In other words, for those who might not remember, the encouragement on the part of NATO of Kosovo independence away from Serbia, a traditional Russian ally.
Not just encouragement, but military campaign.
Military support,
and that was the first time NATO used military force, and that was, by the way, part of the whole discussion about NATO enlargement, because I think many people here forget that coincided. The first wave of NATO enlargement was, I think, February '99. This official ceremony, it was already decided, but official ceremony that Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary joined NATO, that was February '99. And a couple of weeks after, NATO launched first ever military operation against another country.
Without the approval of the UN Security Council, which was
that's a debate, because you know that in Russia, interpretation of this resolution was different. But anyway.
Without, I said without.
Without, yes, exactly.
Without
Sorry.
no.
And that was, of course, a very powerful boost to those who said that NATO is not at all a defensive alliance. And what happened after it just confirmed. And secondly, I think, of course, Ukraine was an absolutely fatal development, because NATO enlargement was, okay, Russia rejected many things, but Russia finally accepted both Eastern Europe and Baltic states. And I remember myself a lot of discussions with my European and American friends in 2000s, when I tried to convince, to bring them this idea that Ukraine is something very much different. And I remember response all the time, many times. They said, okay, we understand your feelings, but look, Russia was unhappy about Poland, Hungary, accepted. Russia was furious about Lithuania, Estonia, accepted. Why Ukraine is different? And when I tried to say Ukraine is different, believe me, okay, come on. So now we see. And I think that NATO enlargement, the major problem was not even enlargement, but the feeling that this is indefinite. And this is another long discussion, how we came to that, and I think it is rooted in the unification of Germany with this situation when Gorbachev, who accepted NATO membership of Germany, but didn't want to say it because he understood that it would be perceived very badly, he agreed to this formula that any country has right to choose alliances. It was even at that time a bit hypocritical, but because it was no alliance to choose anymore, just one, because Warsaw Pact was on the way to collapse. And that was, and afterwards, it was used as a reason why NATO has right to expand indefinitely. And that was, so I would say Yugoslavia and Ukraine, there were two turning points. Yeah.
Okay, right there, yes. Could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, the deterioration of development. So to see the regulation. How much and very little, sort of patterns to follow at this point. Do you think there is going to be any effort to redefine or come up with a new kind of approach to Europe because of this?
I spent 3 months this summer in Germany trying to understand the mood there. And I can say that Europe is in a very, very difficult situation because of US mostly. Russian problem is there since Ukrainian crisis, but now it's very much catalyzed by US problem. And yes,
The U.S. problem being all this uncertainty that you alluded to with respect to the new
exactly
administration.
the lack of understanding what transatlantic relationship means for the U.S. leadership now and in the future. That's, I think, that undermines such important fundamentals for German politics, for example. They don't know how to react, basically. In Russia, we traditionally had a group of thinkers, pretty powerful ones, who believed that in case of divide between Russia and Europe and America, Europe might turn to continental values and to continental dimension, and it would mean rather more interest for rapprochement with Russia. I don't think it is the case now. We see change between America and Europe, and it's, as many Europeans, I don't understand how far it can go. I think that this decrease of interest for Europe started well before Trump. It started under George W. Bush and Barack Obama in a completely different way, but he continued that. But at the same time, those who believe that Europe can turn to Russia instead of alliance with America, I don't think it's correct to expect, because Europe is now very much scared, rightly or wrongly scared by Russia. And any kind of new beginning with Russia might be possible in case Europe would feel more secure, to have US backing or to have some other credentials to rely on. It's not the case now. Europe is very much confused inside. Election
And divided.
And divided, yeah. Election in Germany did not produce result which people expected. Angela Merkel won much less than she wanted, and there is no powerful mandate for her to change European Union. And that means that I think personally, and we wrote it with my friends and my colleagues, that attempts to play on European divide on the Russian side are wrong, because Europe is divided even without us, and it is deepening. To try to make emphasis on alternative forces, be it right wing or right left, it doesn't produce any desirable result, because they will not win in any European country. I don't think so. They will influence atmosphere, yes, but not much more. And actually, we had an interesting exercise in Moscow in the framework of Valdai Club with people, pretty important people from administration, from the government, representatives from different bodies, about European Union. And we asked, it was on the off-record, strongly off-record basis, we asked colleagues the provocative question, would it be in Russian interest if European Union would collapse? And the reaction was very interesting, because it was no immediate response. People started to think, really. And again, that was not just experts, that was people from practitioners. But finally they said no. No, because whatever we think about the situation in the European Union, and the Russian feeling is frequently that forces which are least positive towards Russia are running this show, but still collapse of European integration would bring Europe back to era where Europe produced trouble for everybody, including Russia. Because if you look at history, many terrible things came to Russia out of from European turmoil. So in Russian interest, objectively, would be continued European integration, much more economic oriented, with less political dimension, something like European Community before European Union, when it was economic, single market and so, but much less political unity and political power at the level of European institutions. So I don't think that there is any chance for Russia to use this situation in Europe and between Europe and the United States to achieve more vis-à-vis European Union. You can remember situation 2003, Iraq War, when NATO for the first time was divided, and not just Russia, but very powerful allies of the United States opposed this invasion. And it's quite interesting. I think it's worth remembering. Putin's position initially on when it became clear that Bush was going to launch this campaign, preparation was going on, Putin's position was quite evasive. He said basically, not exactly, but the position was, guys, you make terrible stupidity. You will regret it powerfully, but go ahead. If you want, go ahead. And he didn't, at that time, it was still pretty confidential relationship between him and George W. Bush, and he didn't want to destroy it because of Iraq. And he changed his position after he visited France and Germany in February 2003. And it was very interesting how his rhetoric changed after President Chirac personally met him at the airport in Paris, personally, which was very much beyond any protocol, took him to Élysée, and then they discussed in a couple of hours, and suddenly after that Putin started to talk in Chirac's term about multipolar world, about US hegemony. He didn't do it before. Why he did it? He did it because he believed that by ranking with Germany and France in this very important thing and risking relationship with the United States, he expected significant breakthrough in relationship with the European Union after that. It didn't happen because when it ended up, as we know, the response on the European side was, oh great, thank you very much. We were on the right side of history. We defended international law. And now to Brussels, please. All practical relationship with Brussels. And that was it. So I think that there are no big illusions in Moscow since that European Union might be changed.
Thank you. Very fascinating answer. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Wait.
Emma Bates, first year conflict management. To bring up the subject that you alluded to with the interference with the election, to the extent that Russians, to generalize, believe that it happened, what do you think is the attitude towards it? I know that in the United States, when we think about the way that we've interfered in elections and things like that, there's a certain self-consciousness about it. And I wonder if that's similar in Russia, or if there's an element of pride there, of having influenced something, exercised some kind of soft power, moving up in the world in some way.
It's very long and pretty fruitless discussion, who interfered where. In general, it's no secret that big powers try to influence elections in other powers. Russia went through quite unique experience because, as I mentioned in my previous answer, the Russian situation in 1990s was pretty unique because Russia wanted actually US participation. We have no time. I can tell you a lot of interesting stories from my personal experience. When 1993, as a young journalist, I worked for a very well-known American PR communication company, which helped to support privatization in Russia. Sawmill Group, very famous company. It went bankrupt since that. By the way, my boss, I was at the lowest level. I wrote some articles. My boss, brilliant guy, very young, brilliant lawyer from New York. Recently, I accidentally discovered that he is now personal lawyer of General Flynn. that was interesting to see. And
he needs a brilliant lawyer.
oh yes, he was really brilliant. I don't met him since that, but that was time when American participation in Russian domestic politics was, so to say, it went without saying because Russia was not against it. I can tell you how it worked in reality and how much damaging it was to everybody, both to Americans and to Russian development. But it was, and then you know the participation of US consultants in 1996 elections by Boris Yeltsin and many other things. So in this regard, Russian feeling is that, so to say, we have right to respond. Of course, at that time, means were different. Now we have different entourage and so. But at the same time, again, I don't know what happened, but I would never believe in that level of sophistication, which I hear from U.S. media or from those reports, because if it's true, for example, I was stupid enough to agree to participate at a panel at the Munich Security Conference last February about Russian meddling. It was 6 Americans and Brits and myself. And that was funny experience. Nick Burns was moderator. He was kind enough to say that we have 6 prosecutors and one defender. I was very thankful that he didn't call me the guy who is under trial. But the most fantastic intervention was by the person, I don't remember his name. He is a senior partner in the company, IT company, which on behalf of US government investigated that. And he said, we have, of course, no doubt that Russians were everywhere. And he said, what did impress me mostly? I was impressed by level of Russian sophistication. Okay, DNC servers and all this, that's not interesting. But on the level of local, on the states, local elections in states assemblies, Russians intervened to support one kind of candidates against other kind of candidates, which were more, for some reasons, better for Russia. Sorry, I cannot believe it. No way. Because if those specialists are present in my country, then I'm very, very sad. Where are they? Why we don't see them in our politics, in our technology? It's unbelievable. First of all, to identify which candidate in state of Alabama is better for Russia. And second, to have sophistication to intervene in the electoral system. Sorry. So in this regard, I think we have a very complicated situation when all this stuff is not under serious investigation. Rather, it's becoming a political mean. And as it's a great English expression, which has no equivalent in Russia, it goes without saying. So it goes without saying. We know that Russians intervened. We know that. Let's discuss something else. It's no way to go out from that, unfortunately.
I can't help but recall that when I was a very, very young man, just a refugee and an immigrant in this country, in 1957, and the great Russian technological advance was everywhere. Sputnik, which meant that Russia was ahead of anybody else in the world, including the United States. In science in general, that was the assumption at the time. And I remember that I didn't believe it. Just like you are skeptical about Alabama or Wisconsin, I couldn't believe that the Russia I knew was capable of such a magnificent scientific achievement. But it was.
Okay.
It was. And so I don't know. I'm also a bit skeptical about the details, as you seem to be. You know, how did they pick Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan? Unless they had some help, but we will not go into that detail. But it is interesting that and I'm saying this to the audience here, that I think other Russians like you ask the same question. If we are so clever and so technologically advanced and skillful and indeed brilliant as to have achieved what Rachel Maddow and others believe that Russia has achieved, you know, how come Russia outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg looks the way it does? You know, that there is a kind of contradiction in all this that I suppose neither you nor I can fully appreciate. Yeah. But, okay, any students? I'm looking for students here still. Okay, here you go. Sorry about that, gentlemen.
My name is Francesco Calzoni. I am a second-year student. And I wanted to ask you whether you see some sort of psychological legacy from the Cold War in the events that led to the Ukraine crisis, both from an American and a Russian perspective.
Yes and no. Of course, the Cold War is still something which is fresh in our memories, and most importantly, from completely different angles. Russia looks at that from the position of defeated part, and America from the position of winners, which makes situation, as you say, psychologically much more complicated. At the same time, I wouldn't subscribe everything to the Cold War, because Cold War was pretty unique period in the history of international relations. Never before and never after, maybe, we saw such kind of stable balance of forces confirmed by mutually assured destruction, nuclear arms, and ideological divide. So it's not the case now. It will not be the case in the future, because even if we assume that China will rise that much that it will be, so to say, comparable, equivalent to the Soviet Union before, in terms of ideology, it's something completely different kind of interaction. I would rather refer, on the Russian side, it has much more to do with the traditional thinking, the history of how Russian state evolved, and Russian state emerged from the beginning as a mean, this expansion of territories as a mean to try to avoid unexpected attacks, because this is a flat territory. It's not like United States, when you, especially before, you could not come and attack at any moment. You should prepare it, and it's far away. So in Russia, it's a different geopolitical, traditional geopolitical thinking, and the whole movement at all directions was just to extend time which the potential enemy would need to reach the core, so to say, the center. And if you look at changes, if you compare situation 1990, for example, and today, how far away another military alliance moved closer to the core of Russian everything, then so this tradition of thinking is very much back. So we can have a long discussion about the nature of NATO. Was it same kind of alliances which came to Russia before or not? But this fact of life, psychologically, it's very much deeper than just the Cold War. The Cold War was rather another experience. It was experience of very much equal competition. So now we don't have it. And to a certain extent, it's worse.
So I saw 3 hands, so I'm going to ask you to ask your questions as concisely as possible, and then give you the floor to respond to whatever you like responding. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Lauri Mälksoo. I'm professor of international law at the University of Tartu in Estonia and currently fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center here. This idea that it's now more dangerous than during the Cold War. Also, you mentioned in the context of Iraq war, international law, Chirac and Putin meeting in Paris. And Russia likes to emphasize international law in its strategic documents. How do you see, I know that you're not a lawyer, how do you see Russia actually thinks about international law? Is there still, after these events that we discuss here, international law that, for example, smaller states in this neighborhood where we live can rely on?
Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is David Jackson. I'm a former director of Voice of America. You observed earlier that Donald Trump may be not so much a cause, but a result of the nationalist passions sweeping through many countries. And I would suggest that maybe you can look at Central Europe and Western Europe and find examples that would bolster that, because many of these people preceded Trump. My question is, Putin could be described as a guy whose governing philosophy is make Russia great again. And so going back to your prediction about who will follow Trump, who do you think will follow Putin? Another Putin-like nationalist, or someone, will Russia be different from that trend?
Okay. I think this is about it. Everybody happy? Yes.
Okay. About international law, of course, till 2014, Russian position was very consistent. You might like it or not, but it was very clear that international law, no changes without, and so on. And Kosovo, in this regard, was a very important example for Russian narrative, how other countries, Americans in particular, violate international law. When Crimea came, I think a colleague of mine formulated that in a very elegant way in a publication just at that time. Russia destroyed US monopoly on violation of international law. Of course, I belong to those, and there are not many, but some people in Moscow, in our discussions, who believe that when President Putin first in his speech in March 2014, and then recently at Valdai again, referred to Kosovo as example, not just a precedent, but as example vis-a-vis Crimea, I think it was wrong, because then we should recognize Kosovo. Maybe we will do at the end, but still, of course, it's quite obvious that it was some kind of break of tradition. But I tend to believe, unlike many people here, and especially in your country or in Baltic states, that Ukraine is a very exceptional case, and Crimea was a very exceptional case. It was a result of a very long development, which had to do not only with Ukraine, But what we discussed here, NATO enlargement and many things which happened after the end of the Cold War, it culminated there. It wasn't very fortunate, to put it very mildly, but it happened. It is not seen by anybody in Moscow as a matrix, as a pattern to follow. In this regard, I think that international law should be brought back to the table, just to assure countries like Estonia or anybody, because it's important. We see this development everywhere. And what started with American moves without sanctions of UN Security Council or Kosovo or many other things, or what is China doing now in the South China Sea, those are very clear signs of general disturbance in international system. Because again, I'm not a lawyer, and I understand that for a lawyer it might sound terrible, but international law, there are no 10 commandments got by Moses from God. This is product of agreements between actors. If actors agree to respect it, they do. If they fail to respect, then something should be done with this stuff. So I think that we are moving towards some kind of reconfirmation of international law at the new level. But of course, it's very difficult because things which happened after the Cold War and after the bipolar system damaged a lot. And it was not only because of some egotistic interests, but for example, if we look at how such notion as responsibility to protect emerged in the international discourse, to a certain extent it was a violation of traditional norms. And if we, for very good reasons, started to challenge sovereignty, then of course we can move step by step very, very far in this direction, both for good and bad reasons. About make Russia great again, yeah, of course. And but the difference is that when Putin got this duty, Russia was in much worse shape than than America when Trump came. At least I think.
He said it was a carnage that he inherited.
Okay, he knows better. But anyway, for Putin, that was a leitmotif. If you read his article published the day before Yeltsin resigned, this Russia at Turn of Millennium, very interesting article, still worth to read. We didn't know yet that it was manifesto of the guy who tomorrow will be our president, but he put it in very, very clear terms that the main task is to guarantee that Russia remains in the first echelon of countries. Otherwise, we have risk to go downstairs much far. And he did it, I think many things he did in 2000s were absolutely inevitable. Whoever would succeed Yeltsin would have to do it, even, I don't know, Chubais or who else. To a certain extent, I think I wrote an article a couple of years ago after emergence of Trump, that yes, Putin is, I called it part-time Trump, because what happened 2012 when we had this turmoil in Moscow with the so-called creative class or middle class, the part of intelligentsia, voiced their unsatisfaction about what is going on. And that was a turning point for Putin, because he was he was deeply hurt by that, because he rightly believed that all those people benefited very much out of his rule. And that was true. He could not understand why now this. You live best life ever. What else you need? And he made a very important decision for himself. He sided with majority, while before he tried to play a role as a president of all Russians. But then, since he was deeply disappointed in this minority, and that was a tiny minority actually, tiny but very active minority, he decided to rank with majority, and he believed that this minority is very much destabilizing and destructive. And that was why he, to a certain extent, prevented the emergence of populism in Russia, so far at least. Because Russia is not immune from any trends internationally, and I think that we will face similar surge of populism in our country pretty soon. Putin is now, so to say, guarantee against that, but he is not forever and he is not almighty. Mr. Navalny, who is the big celebrity in the West, if you look at him as a political animal, he's a typical populist politician, as in Europe, as here, because he skillfully uses two most popular ideas, anti-corruption plus nationalism. That's a very great combination. It has nothing to do with the ability to run the country, but it is very, very good. I don't think he personally will be successful, but somebody of this style might be pretty important in years to come. And as for Putin's successor, okay, my personal suggestion would be the next term, the term starting 2018, will be the last one for President Putin. He has no wish to stay forever. And if he will need to stay, for reasons that he would not be able to facilitate smooth succession, that he himself will see it as a personal defeat. He doesn't want to be in the same category of leaders as Nazarbayev or Robert Mugabe. It's not his intention. But it means that he will dedicate next term to trying to find ways how to start to change the system, because in order to facilitate succession, he will need to change the system, because the current system, whether we like it or not, is very much based on his personal legitimacy, not just on the legitimacy of presidential republic, but legitimacy of President Putin, for reasons which we can discuss, but there's very strong foundations for that. And then he needs to start to turn system in much more diversified one, and then to facilitate this succession. I don't believe that any next leader would be profoundly different, because mood of Russians is not comparable to what we had, say, 25, 30 years ago. It's completely different atmosphere. It might change, of course, and I hope it will change, because current atmosphere is far from great. And the instrumentalization of foreign policy, both here and in Russia, is obvious. So it will change inevitably. We see how the president is trying to promote very young technocrats, just trying to change the narrative a bit. And for example, the recent speech at Valdai, I think it was a very, very interesting combination. He tried to speak about the future. If you took some parts of the section, that was very new. He never did it before. He tried to speak about the future. Unfortunately, past is grabbing back, but it's at least half and half. And I think Russia is entering a very, very important period of changes. We should not expect come back to, I hope so, actually, come back to those debates we had 25 years ago. So we should learn something from that experience. It's not always happening, but still. So Russia will change inevitably, and Russia will change, of course, in certain harmony or disharmony, I don't know how to call it, but international climate and international situation is extremely important. We cannot expect any kind of development, either positive or negative, disconnected from what is happening around us. So in this regard, Russia is a part of globalized world, and there is no chance to escape it.
Well, given the interesting future you just described, you'll have to come back and talk to us again.
You know, I hope I will be back for sure. I hope, since you mentioned the musical, and I love this genre very much, I hope that next time I will be able to come to New York and see a musical about Russian hackers, because this is a very interesting topic.
Thank you very much. Thank you very